Further remarks? Gentleman from the 2nd District, Representative Barkis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, this has been a very good civil debate. It's something that we're supposed to do in this chamber, Mr. Speaker. We're supposed to take difficult issues. We're supposed to talk about them, and then we're supposed to make decisions about those issues. I want to thank the good lady from the 43rd for she has been very gracious in working together on a very complicated, big issue. But Mr. Speaker, it's tough when you try to bring all these various stakeholders, and like what was said by my colleague from the 18th, we try to do this policy and legislate for these specific subsets. But yet we have to design legislation that affects all of us in the state of Washington. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear the story from my colleague from the 29th. She shared that story with me when I first got here because she knows the business I'm in. And I, along with others, listened to that story. And we tried to help, and we have offered and done many things along those lines within the context of that, because it's a real issue and a real story. And it impacts, just like my being in the business, it impacts the narrative of what we're trying to accomplish with this policy. And Mr. Speaker, what I'm afraid happens is that these policies get affected by these subsets, and all of a sudden it changes into something that has greater effect on many, many, many trying to deal with one certain area. And that's dangerous when we're doing this kind of work. There were some good amendments, Mr. Speaker. We even got close on a couple of them. Mr. Speaker, this policy as it stands today is a very complicated, very large, very difficult policy that's going to have challenges for those that are the smaller landlord. For those that have companies and they're bigger, they can handle these adjustments. They make a policy adjustment within their corporation. They can handle the additional days. It's not really going to change too much, but it does have a broader reach on those smaller landlords. I want to compliment the stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, when this first started out, the stakeholders were very genuine in trying to get this together, and some of the stakeholders on some of the sides were pushing a little bit too hard on a specific narrative, which made it very challenging to get to certain things, especially when you're out of balance. The scales gets a little too far tipped to the tenant side. The landlords try to pull it back, and the tenants push a little harder, and you're trying to get this balance in there. And I do think they did a pretty good job to get there. But I think there is more that could be done to make this better policy, and that's why I'm a no today. You see, Mr. Speaker, many suggestions were made, and they weren't accepted. This mitigation fund is a good idea, but there are better ideas. If the problem is that somebody is getting evicted for $50 or $100 or $200 or whatever it might be, Mr. Speaker, we've talked about vouchers for the private sector for years, trying to figure out a way that we could do something up front to get the resources. That's why, Mr. Speaker, the bills that I worked on and others introduced earlier in the session talked about that. We give more time, we do more education and more resources. How do we get this stopped before we get to this point? This piece of legislation deals with after the fact. This gives more time for the tenant to maybe make remedy, but then you've got all the time that impacts the landlord when they have to do that. And Mr. Speaker, I just have to point out that there are bad actors in this world, unfortunately. I've seen it plenty in the business. I know that landlords try to work with people, and it bothers me when I hear a story like I just heard when a landlord, for whatever reason, didn't do that, but I know that's the exception, not the rule. Because I've been talking to hundreds of landlords for years and years and years. Landlords want to avoid the eviction process. You know, it was mentioned that all these fees and legal fees and costs that are going to burden the tenant at the eviction. You want to know something, Mr. Speaker? They're hardly ever paid back. The landlord incurs all those costs, the damages, the fees, the lost rent, the legal fees, everything else, and then has to go to collections or small claims or some other way to try to capture that. And typically, they'll never see a penny. They take the loss. And then they may or may not ever rent again, or worse yet, they sell the property. And I can tell you, I've seen huge attrition over the last several years because we've been watching this kind of policy up north coming down, and arriving here in Olympia, which it did this year. So, Mr. Speaker, I had hoped that we could take care of a few of the key critical components of this piece of law this year. We could give a little more time. 7 days was reasonable. We could give better educational resources. We could do a better notification. We could do many things to help people find those resources to stay in those homes. We could do other policy within this body to get at that root cause, to get at the drugs on the street that are more important than paying your rent because of addiction. There are other things we could be doing, Mr. Speaker, besides this. But, Mr. Speaker, this is kind of where we focused, and this is the policy that we have. And I'm afraid that it's going to do more damage than good, as we've been told, as we've been heard today in this debate. But I am concerned as we move forward. It was my hope, Mr. Speaker, that we would have some good policy that we could take out of here and make some change. And like what was said before, that we could convene during the interim, that we could take more time to really take a deep dive into this landlord-tenant law. It's been a long time since it's been revised. It's been piecemeal revised all over the state. We could take more time. It's tough to do that in 105 days or 88 or whatever day we're at today. It's tough to do that on any issue, especially when you're doing multiple policies and things and all the stuff that we all are doing in this body. It's tough to get good policy, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to close by saying I will continue to work with anybody who wants to work on this. I will continue to work with the good lady from the 43rd. I respect her tremendously for everything she's done in the segment that she works in and her passion for this. And the others who I have worked with during the course of this session on this, Mr. Speaker. But today on this particular bill, I am asking for a no vote from this body.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question before the House is the final passage of engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5600 as amended by the House. The Speaker is about to open the roll call machine. The Speaker has opened the roll call machine. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? The Speaker is about to lock the roll call machine. The Speaker has locked the roll call machine. The clerk will take the record, please.
Mr. Speaker, there are 51 yeas, 46 nays, 1 excused.
Having received the constitutional majority, engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5600 as amended by the House is declared passed.